Good morning. Um, Delighted to be here. I'm somebody who is passionate about Africa, believe in the opportunity in Africa, and I've been, through my career at Standard Chartered, involved in Africa since the turn of the century, and I've been very actively involved across the continent on a number of transactions. I also have the advantage of having been born in Asia and witnessed the Asian economic miracle at close quarters. And I believe that Africa is at a stage exactly where China was in 1990 or India was in 2000. There are lots of similar opportunities as well as challenges. What I've been asked to cover today is really three things. One, to talk about the global political and economic context and what are the implications of that for Africa. Two, are there any lessons that Africa can draw from Asia's development model? And number three, where do I see the opportunities for and in Africa? So, if I can just first talk about the trends. If you look at just the short term, defined as 2018, things are very rosy globally. The world, including Africa, is expected to grow faster in 2018 than in 2017. Barring a few saber rattling from Rocket Man in North Korea or some shenanigans in Yemen, generally the world is a peaceful place and things are pretty rosy. But if I were to fast forward to more medium and longer term, I think the picture is a little more textured and complex. It's more of a Dickensian world. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's the spring of hope, it's the winter of despair. What are some major trends I see? First, it's going to be a multipolar world. Particularly since the end of the Cold War, we've been used to one power, i.e. the United States of America, dominating the world politics and commerce. Now, with a very rising China, a resurgent India, and a more muscular Russia, just to name a few, we are in for a much more complex landscape. And how this is going to pan out is for us all to see. The second trend I see is that of a continuation of the growth in emerging markets. Already, if you look at the last 20 years, South-South trade, i.e. trade between and across emerging markets, has grown twice as fast as global trade. And in emerging markets, already more than 50% of the foreign direct investment has come from other emerging markets. So the South-South remaining and continuing as the dominant economic engine for global growth will continue. Third, I think globalization and technology have created a digital divide. And with the fourth industrial revolution, whether it's artificial intelligence or robotics or whatever else, I see exacerbation of that trend that is going to lead to significant disruption in value chain and a disruption in jobs. And the implications of that are for all of us to consider, especially when the global population is increasing by 1 billion every 12 to 13 years. But what is for sure is that's going to drive up more and more of anti-globalization rhetoric, which we are already witnessing in many parts of the West, but not just in the West. Last but not the least, individuals and companies and non-state actors will become an even bigger threat to the security environment than countries. So, what are the implications of that for Africa? Some positive, some negative. To the extent that it's a multipolar world, Africa will have many more suitors for our attention. To the extent that South-South is going to be the predominant economic dynamo or engine of growth, Africa being firmly in the South-South corridor is going to benefit from it, but some of the other factors could present a tailwind. Let me move on to the African Development Challenge. If you, and I think the previous panelists mentioned it, in the next 15, 20 years, Africa will have more people of a working age than either India or China. But that potential demographic dividend can become a debacle if close to 12 million jobs are not created every single year. Africa, no doubt, has done a fantastic job and made tremendous strides over the last 10 years, but if you just take economic history of the last 50 years, you have to say that Africa has grabbed defeat from the jaws of victory. Just go back to 1967, 50 years ago. Ghana had a higher per capita GDP than Korea, Nigeria higher than China, and Kenya higher than Indonesia. Was it faulty policies? Was it bad execution? Was it lousy leadership, or a combination of all of them? We don't know, but what we don't know for sure is that there are some lessons from the Asian economic miracle that African policymakers could potentially take away to their advantage. One, the importance of foreign direct investment. Africa needs capital. Africa's savings is 15% of GDP. It simply does not have enough capital. Just consider another statistic. Nigeria, one of the largest economies on the continent, the largest. Their banking system is simply inadequate in size to finance Nigeria's own needs, let alone the continent's needs. The aggregate market capitalization of the 10 largest Nigerian banks, is the combined market cap, is less than 1/3 the market cap of the single largest bank in Indonesia, or 1/5 the size of the single largest bank in Brazil. I made the point, Africa needs foreign capital. But in order to get foreign direct investment, Africa needs to seriously think about having the right incentives, having both the hard and soft infrastructure, including vocational training, and having the institutions, the rule of law, stable and sensible exchange regimes, and many other things that Asia had in abundant quantity in order to not just to attract foreign capital, but also domestic capital. The third lesson from Asia was not to ignore domestic consumption and create import substitution industries, particularly with their scale. And the last point I think was very important from Asia is the importance of having regional value chains to create economies of scale and specialization. If you take intra-Asia trade, it constitutes almost 50%, 50, of Asian trade. In Africa, the same number is 15%. So there is a lesson there. Maybe there are some lessons that Africa should not take away from the Asian miracle. One is, in Asia, development models meant moving from an agrarian society to an industrial society to a post-industrial society. I believe that Africa has a huge opportunity in its agriculture and its blue oceans. Equally, when Asia went on its path of development, the major markets and the economic engines were in the West. So it was essentially about trading with the West and exporting to the West. As now the economic engines are going to be in the East, more of a look East policy may be required. So if I can just move on to where do I see the opportunities for and in Africa, I believe some of the big opportunities are in the consumer. This is China 1990, this is India 2000, this is Vietnam 2005. People buying their first microwave, people buying their first refrigerator, their first car, building their first or buying their first apartment. That is a huge opportunity across Africa. Second, agriculture. If you believe that global food consumption is going to increase by 75% over the next 20 to 30 years, Africa has a huge role to play. 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa, and Africa has to be a key part of the equation. But even more important, Africa today imports 1/3 of its food and beverages and similar products, which is a travesty. Even Asia imports only 20% and Mercosur 10%. So there is a big potential in agriculture. The third area is infrastructure. Africa currently spends about $50 billion a year collectively on the infrastructure, but as all of us know, there is a huge infrastructure deficit. And plugging that deficit requires an additional investment of somewhere around $45 to $50 billion every single year for many, many decades to come. Just to illustrate the infrastructure deficit, the country of Nigeria, with 185 million people, generates less electricity than the island state of Singapore with 5.3 million people and 720 square kilometers of territory. So clearly there is a huge potential. It's a glass half full, half not half, and half empty. Labor-intensive manufacturing is another area where I believe there is an opportunity, and already there are about 200 Chinese companies who have migrated their factories from China to Ethiopia because of rising labor cost in China. This is the global export market for labor-intensive manufacturing is close to $1.6 trillion, of which China has got about a third market share. Capturing some part of that is important for Africa, particularly because Africa has gone backwards as a continent in terms of manufacturing, constituting less than 13% of GDP. Last but not the least, I think it's an import substitution. There's no reason why Africa should be a major exporter of oil and yet imports almost all of its refined product. Finally, people like Dangote are setting up a large refinery which will serve just about Nigeria's needs, let alone the continent's huge needs. But if you just take the Dangote cement story, it was again a great example of how import substitution can pay huge dividends on a continent where there is huge basic need. So let me close by saying, and then we'll take questions. One, I believe that the opportunity in Africa is huge. Two, Africa is increasingly getting integrated with the South-South trade and investment flows, but Africa needs to do a much better job in integrating within itself. You need a better African Union in terms of trades, goods, and services, and movement of people. The third message I would say to a lot of LPs in the room is we have these mental biases that we're investing in Asia, we're investing in Africa. The world is no longer works that way. In a globalized world, we are all interconnected. If you invest in a copper mine in Zambia, are you investing in Zambia? Yeah, the political risk is Zambia, but probably the operator is from Canada or Australia. So is it Canadian and Australian risk? Or almost the entire product goes to China or India, so are you taking India or China risk? So some of these paradigms that we have in terms of investing in Africa, we need to rethink, particularly in view of the fact that Africa is increasingly connected with global demand and consumption. And the last point I would make is that the biggest opportunity in Africa is really in targeting companies and industries that produce goods and services which cater to the basic needs of the vast majority of the population, what I would call the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and servicing the bottom of the pyramid, the food, shelter, clothing, data. We at Gateway Partners are basic believers in investing into companies that service the bottom of the pyramid. So the type of investments we have done in Africa include Liquid Telecom, which is the largest optical fiber network across Africa. Data today is as important as biscuits or anything. I say biscuits and bytes are probably the same thing today. We've invested into Dangote Cement, again, a very, very basic need as Africa builds its infrastructure. And we have just established, along with our partners from PIC here, a real estate development company focused on building basic real estate infrastructure, both commercial, residential, and industrial across Africa, a company called Gateway Delta. So I think, as Shakira, the songstress, said, this time for Africa, I'm excited by the opportunity, so you should. Thank you.